And now we come to the second keynote seminars, which is going to be delivered by Professor Charles Taylor. And it's my role to introduce him about his biography before he comes on stage. Professor Peter Charles Taylor is the professor of STEAM education and also the adjunct professor of transformative education at Murdoch University, Australia. He is also the chair of International Transformative Educational Research Network, aiming to provide transformative professional development for teachers in universities and schools throughout the Indo-Pacific region. His work for education integrates the arts and science to develop students' transdisciplinary dispositions that include critical reflection, ethical astutness, connectiveness, and also creativity. All these are essential capabilities for living and working sustainably in this very complex and contested world in the 21st century. Now, may I invite Professor Peter Charles Taylor to share his expertise on how transformative STEAM education can develop our students' transdisciplinary capabilities. Professor Charles Taylor, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind invitation. If you'll just excuse me, I'm going to do a technology check.
So you'll be controlling the computer up there.
Up there?
So
okay.
Like for your videos, you cannot be fast forward, but we can just play that.
So, like April, I've got animations. Can I use? This will help with the animations.
Yes, actually, this still work like yesterday, but
yeah.
things but
Good.
What you mentioned is that you need for fast forward the videos.
Yeah.
Not before working.
Right. Okay. Let's see how we go.
So, disturbing it?
Yeah. No. I need that open. I need that open. Can you?
You need yours?
Yeah. I need mine. As much as I love April's, I need mine. Good. And I need the presentation view, not the. Yeah, let's see. Good. Just need to get it up there. Okay. Right. Okay. Thank you. Look, I'm just so happy and grateful to have been invited to this extraordinarily innovative conference. There's nothing like this in Australia. STEAM education is just being born across Australia. STEM rules, and there is a distinct difference between the two, which I'll explain to you. So from what I've seen so far, the innovative work by these students at university and at schools across Hong Kong in the STEAM space is very, very inspiring. And I think that Ocean Park is very well situated with the support from the government and from the university sector to really take a leading role in the Asia-Pacific region in relation to STEAM education. We can't live by acronyms alone. So STEM or STEAM are just acronyms, and we need to unpack them. We need good educational theory to inform our unpacking of these acronyms. So what I intend to do in the next little while is to talk to you about why I think it's really, really important to bring in the A into STEM, but also more than that, another T, and that's transformative learning theory. So we end up with ST squared EAM, and I challenge you to pronounce that. And it's particularly important because the focus here is on sustainability education. STEM has been a magnificent endeavour for the last several hundred years since the Industrial Revolution, and even in the West, and even before that in China, where many of the ideas came from to inform the Western progress model. And we now have all these incredible things that, as a child in the 1950s, were even undreamt of. And I won't unpack each one of those, but just to point out, Sophia, for example, a robot, a humanoid, who's been given citizenship status, or I think it's Saudi Arabia. So we're getting closer and closer to having robots and human beings converging. That sounds exciting, particularly in the context of transportation. But I'd like you to consider something else beyond that. When robots have got a high degree of autonomy because of advanced artificial intelligence, that they can go out and have dinner with each other in a romantic setting. Okay, first technology glitch. My screen and this screen are not correlated. Is that because I'm using the keypad? Okay, so if I go to the next one.
Yep, so you just need to go.
Using that?
Yep.
Okay. You know, I rehearsed this yesterday and it was perfect. But using somebody else's computer, it's always a steep learning curve. So I apologise for the glitches that I think are going to happen. Okay, so a little quote there. Oh, that's crazy. My parents were vacuum cleaners too. So you've got a couple of humanoids, very advanced, having a conversation over dinner. And if anybody has seen this movie, it really brings it home with great emotional force. It's about a guy who designs humanoids, and he brings a young fellow in, the guy in the middle, to spend a week living with this very attractive female robot to test her, to give her the Turing test. That is, can he differentiate between the robot and a human being? And as the movie unfolds, I won't spoil the plot for you, but the robot becomes more intelligent than the person who's testing her, and all sorts of unexpected things happen. So science fiction has always led the way with our imaginations in the STEM area, and I highly recommend this because it raises a particular ethical issue. Not that one yet, but the one before it. Here we go. I think I just found the right button on this thing. Okay, the ethical dilemma of my screen and that screen are out of sync, so it's a little bit awkward. Okay, the ethical dilemma of human rights. Should robots, advanced robots with artificial intelligence, have human rights? And the word should means it's an ethical issue. And ethics at the moment is largely missing in a formal sense from our STEM education, and that's where the arts are so important, and I'll elaborate on that in a little while. The arts brings in a set of capabilities for considering extremely important and pressing ethical issues. And I've just used the little robot here as an example of a much bigger problem that we have, and that is next slide. The Anthropocene. Now, you've probably heard of the term anthropology. It's about the study of humans, about study of cultures. The people who work in geophysics have coined this new term, the Anthropocene, as a new era that means that, and in the words of Steve Fuller, here we go. In the words of Steve Fuller, the human imprint on the global environment has become so large and active that it rivals some of the great forces of nature in its impact on the functioning of the Earth's systems. So we're talking here about the natural systems being the atmosphere, being the oceans, and also the landmass. The Earth has been able to look after itself for billions of years until humans evolved. And in this modern era, we have such a very large footprint that we're disturbing many of the natural systems. Not the least of which is me right now. Okay, there's a metaphor, there's a visual metaphor for our footprint. And you can actually get a personal measurement of your human footprint by going to that website and filling in a survey, and it calculates numerically the impact of your personal footprint on the Earth. And I did it for myself. And if everybody lived like me, everybody in the world, it tells me that we would need 6 Earths. So we obviously don't want everybody in the world to live like me, even though I'm very sustainability conscious. So we're using up the world's resources at a rapid and alarming rate. and that is why...
Actually, yeah, controlling the computer.
Oh, there.
You can just press it.
So there's a robot up there controlling my slides. Oh, right, okay.
What is
We need to have an ethical conversation about what it's doing to me. Okay, all right, good. Learning on the job here. As good teachers always do, you know, nothing goes according to plan all the time. So, okay, here's a little... The Earth is in a bad state, and all the other planets in the solar system are very concerned about the problem that the Earth has. It's getting sicker and sicker, and there doesn't seem to be any way of recovery. The problem is the Earth has humans. I don't know which one is Mars, but Mars is also looking a bit worried too, as we continue to take our civilization to that planet. So what should I say? Next slide, please. Is that the idea? Okay, so this is where we live, all of us. There's no alternative. We have to look after it. Unfortunately, the Earth is suffering from a number of severe crises. The ones that I'm particularly interested in my work, is avoiding cultural extinction through the loss of languages, climate emergency, which recently was called climate change, but now that the International Panel of Climate Scientists have released their latest report, we know that we have until 2030 to turn things around, to limit average global temperature increase by 1.5 degrees. And that's the subject of the Paris Agreement. And if we don't do it and we get to 2.5 degrees, your typhoons that you have at the moment will seem quite minor and minuscule. But the one that I want to address today is plastic pollution, particularly of the marine environment and where it comes from. So there's a movie here that I've put together from bits and pieces on the internet just to show you the scope and scale of this problem. Now, I'm not sure that I can start it, so maybe the folks upstairs. There we go. So these were just accessed off the internet. There's nothing special about it. There's no copyright. And there should be some sound just to make it more emotionally engaging. Some sound. So I really focused on countries in our region, the Asia-Pacific region. So this is in Manila. That's a canal, by the way. It's not a footpath.
Filthy, seething sea of trash is an open dump. It is actually a dam. The rubbish covers 200,000 square meters and in some places piles up to 1 meter high. Bordering the provinces of Guangdong and Hunan, Lechang Gorge Dam is a major flood control facility for the Beijiang River, the northern tributary of southern China's Pearl River. The dam is also the main source of drinking water for some 180,000 locals. Torrential rain in late March washed down all this trash, making the area unsafe for people and damaging the environment downstream.
Bangkok, 12 million people producing plastic waste. Much of it ends up here in the city's canals. Cups, bottles, food containers and bags. Plastic so tough it can last hundreds of years without degrading. Huge amounts of waste is carried into rivers and then onwards to the ocean. Rivers like the Mekong, which flows through 6 Asian countries, China, Myanmar, Cambodia, Thailand, Laos and Vietnam, before dumping the waste into the South China Sea.
Okay, you can,
morning we're down at Apple Bay.
cut it at that point. Stop
Just
the
across
movie.
the harbour from the Sydney Harbour Bridge and the Opera House. Beautiful, iconic location, and this beach is hammered with plastic. The things that we'll find on this beach are very likely to be consumer items.
Okay. There are lots of movies. I'd love to show all of them to you, but there just isn't time. So that is a look at Sydney Harbour, the beaches around there, and the amount of single-use plastic pollution that is washed up on those shores. So Australia is just as implicated in this problem as all the other countries in the region. So this is basically what we're facing: massive plastic pollution of our oceans, coming from our river systems, looking aesthetically very bad, but much more than that, very, very dangerous indeed. And I do have another movie. Now, I don't want to show the whole thing because it's quite long, but if my kind movie director upstairs could start it at 1 minute 50, if that's possible. If we can get it started and then fast forward to 1 minute 50. Is it possible to
Plastic is
fast forward?
wonderful because it's durable, and plastic is terrible because it is durable. Almost every piece of plastic ever made is still on the planet in some form or another. Plastic production globally this year is expected to be more than 300 million tonnes.
Half of which we'll use just once and then throw away. By 2050, when the population explodes to almost 10 billion people, it's expected that plastic production will triple. The problem with that is that today only a fraction of the plastic that we produce is recycled. The rest ends up in our environment, and it's coating our land and our oceans like a disease.
Garbage thrown away in the United States can make its way to Antarctica. Plastic in our coastal waters is pulled into the centre of massive wind-driven, churning circular gyres. There are many other ocean currents also diverting the trash all around the surface of the ocean. In reality, it's just one ocean with no boundaries. Lord Howe Island is a World Heritage Site and home to migratory seabirds like the shearwater.
Seabirds are incredibly helpful because they act like an army of scientists. They travel thousands of miles across the ocean. They pick up plastic off the surface of the ocean. They bring it back to their rookeries where they feed it to their chicks. And that provides an incredible amount of scientific data in terms of where the plastic comes from, its distribution, and how it breaks up on the ocean surface. Dr. Jennifer Lavers, she's devoted her life to studying the plight of seabirds.
Yeah, this is really what I wanted us to have a look at.
Shearwaters are incredible birds. They migrate thousands of miles, stopping only here to breed.
Yeah, the stomach is very, very full, and if we look here, there's some very dark pieces, some very light white pieces, and if you see, as I push on this, it's absolutely rigid, completely full of plastic all the way up.
Oh, look at that.
Absolutely no doubt this bird died as a result of that plastic. That is literally a gut full of plastic. It's quite alarming, isn't it?
Oh, that's awful.
Range of plastic types and colours. We've got everything from the blues and the reds
His
to the
stomach's just filled with it. Big pieces too.
big sharp
Heavy.
pieces.
Oh, wow, look at the size of that big black piece.
That is an enormous piece of plastic.
Unbelievable. Look at the size of that.
Okay, thanks. Can you cut that, please? Stop it. They counted over 200 pieces of plastic, and it's not a world record for them. I've seen that quite a number of times, and I find it gruesome on a number of levels, particularly, if you love animals. So the next slide, please. Okay, so one of the problems with plastics is that it becomes invisible when it gets into the waterways after a period of time. It doesn't dissolve necessarily. What it tends to do is to break down into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces, which are called microplastics, and that can be almost invisible. They can be a tenth of a millimetre. Some of those were in the bird, but obviously there were bigger ones as well. That's a picture of my local supermarket in Perth. It's absolute nonsense to wrap bananas in plastic in the supermarket. So, we've got a long way to go. Even though that supermarket no longer provides single-use plastic bags, you have to bring your own container. They still present most of their foodstuffs in plastic wrap. Where does it go? Have we got good recycling systems? And we're only really starting to get there. Single-use plastic straws, and with clothing, often we'll get a lovely fleecy warm top, although possibly not in Hong Kong. And when we wash it, of course, all the little fibres come out and go down the drain, and they go through the filtration systems of the water purification and out into the ocean. Microplastics. Next slide. Okay, I've just covered that really. Next one, please. So it's not just a physical problem that you consume plastic and it gives you a stomach ache or, stops you from eating any other food. Each little tiny piece of plastic attracts other toxic chemicals, and there's just a good example. So if you're teaching chemistry education, there's a good opportunity to put this knowledge of compounds, molecules and so on into this particular context. Next slide. I would like to show you a couple of other videos, but I think it'll take too long. There's some pretty horrific stuff. Have anybody seen the video of the sea turtle that has been taken out of the ocean, and it has something stuck in its nose, and over about 2 or 3 grueling minutes they pull out a plastic straw, and the sea turtle was in absolute agony and there's blood dripping down. The beached whales, this particular one in Thailand, washed up, they cut it open, its stomach was full of kilograms and kilograms of plastic bags. So I show you these things, and I put a big effort to emphasise the problem, because I think we really need to engage with the problem at an emotional level, not just a theoretical level. Next slide. We'll jump that one onto the next one. That's it. So the World Economic Forum released a report in 2016, and that said that each year at least 8 million tonnes of plastics leak into the ocean, which is the equivalent of dumping the contents of one garbage truck into the ocean every minute. And if that's not bad enough, then next animation, please. The ocean is expected to contain, by the year 2025, 1 tonne of plastic for every 3 tonnes of fish. And by 2050, the year I turn 100, more plastics than fish by weight. under the current conditions, and I find that absolutely staggering and appalling. Next slide, and we'll look 10 seconds of this only. I went to Bali as a young man as a backpacker for holidays. It was a beautiful, organically rich country. Since plastics have arrived, guess what? If you like scuba diving or going in the ocean, this is what you can see around the Balinese coastline. Okay, that'll do, thank you. You can stop that. Next slide. So what we have here is a legacy that we're creating, an intergenerational legacy for the children of the future. And I'm so pleased that the children today are waking up to this and protesting en masse worldwide, marching through the streets, walking out of the school for the day and saying, it's our future, we demand action. They have a moral imperative driving them forward, and rightly so. Next slide. So we have an ethical dilemma here, and this is the concept that I want to end on, the notion of teaching ethical dilemmas in the STEM space, making it a STEAM space. So we have the convenience of single-use plastics and everything that entails around that with production and manufacturing costs and profit versus the cost to the environment. Next slide, and this requires urgent action. Move on. Okay, so, yep, another one please. So what I'm proposing here is that, just go back one, is that in STEM education, we don't just deal with objective factual knowledge, which is my experience as a student and subsequently as a science and physics teacher. I was guilty of that too. But we bring in values education. Now, values exist to a small degree. Kids are told to shut up, sit down, be quiet, respect the teacher. There are values there, but I want to go beyond that. I want to have values that connect with the imperative of sustainability education. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah, okay, next slide. Next one, we'll skip that. Okay, so these are some of the images that you might associate with the traditional approach to teaching science and maths, which is what I did in my early days. And I think, it's not altogether unknown that this exists in classrooms today. And it's a very constraining approach to engaging students in learning. Next slide, please. And perhaps overstating the case, this is assessment. And this kind of assessment really doesn't win the day when it comes to STEAM education. Next slide. So how do we overcome these problems? How do we have an education system, next slide, that is going to be inspiring? And teachers need to go through a process of professional development that is inspiring. So where do we get our inspiration from? There are many different places. In Indonesia, many teachers are of the Islamic faith, and they draw their inspiration from the Quran. But there are many places, next slide please, that we can go to for inspiration. I'll just familiarise you with the Earth Charter. We stand at a critical moment in Earth's history, a time when humanity must choose its future. As the world becomes increasingly interdependent and fragile, the future at once holds great peril and great promise. To move forward, we must recognise that in the midst of a magnificent diversity of cultures and life forms, we are one human family and one Earth community with a common destiny. We must join together to bring forth a sustainable global society founded on respect for nature, universal human rights, economic justice, and a culture of peace. Wonderful altruistic principles. Towards this end, it is imperative that we, the peoples of Earth, declare our responsibility to one another, to the greater community of life, and to future generations. It's the intergenerational issue I mentioned earlier. Next slide. And from the United Nations, that's been battling away with UNESCO for at least 20 years now, trying to engage us in education for sustainable development. Their latest report in 2030, the Agenda for Sustainable Development, there's a small quote there. Education that engages young people in debate about their ethical convictions, about environmental, political, socio-cultural and economic issues, giving rise to a possible transformation of their values and beliefs. So we're getting closer and closer now to seeing and understanding what we need to add to the STEM curriculum and teaching space if we're going to observe the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. And the word transformation there is particularly apt. I'm going to unpack that shortly. Next slide, please. I gained my inspiration from nature directly, and there's a little book down the bottom there, or a big book I should say, called Biophilia, The Love of Nature. And I strongly recommend you reading it. It's written by a biologist. It's about his personal experience in fieldwork, written in a first-person narrative voice about his love of the natural world. And that's the Annapurna, a mountain that I was able to get close to in October last year. It's absolutely inspiring. It's called a golden sunrise. So next slide. And this is where we turn to arts education. I think I'll skip that. Next slide, please. As April has told us, the arts have all sorts of, that's it, hold it there. The arts have many things to offer, very, very powerful. The arts writ large is about bringing creativity, aesthetics, ethics, and rhetoric into the STEM mix. So, you know, April's done a great job of pointing out the importance of creativity and aesthetics as well, and I'm focusing here today mainly on the issue of ethics, on virtues, human rights and social justice. And by rhetoric we mean freeing children in STEM classrooms from writing objectively about the information that they're learning and bringing their own personal voices in so that they can explain to themselves, to their fellow students and to teachers who want to assess them about their experience of the learning process. And in that process, reflecting critically on the relationship between their learning experiences and the world at large. Next slide. And do you get it? Okay, next slide. So we need an inspirational philosophy of learning for sustainable development, and next slide tells us that that's readily available from transformative learning theorists. And if you hit the animation for me, throughout the 20th century, animation, next. No, sorry, you're one ahead of me. Go back to the previous slide and hit the animation. There we go, that's what I wanted. These are giants, scholars of the 20th century, in the West, of course, and I'm not saying there aren't any in the East. My colleagues in Nepal and Thailand are drawing on Eastern wisdom traditions at the same time. So, you know, if you've done postgraduate studies, you may have come across some of these gigantic figures in philosophy and psychology, from Paulo Freire, Abraham Maslow, Jacques Mezirow, Carol Gilligan, Parker Palmer, and of course John Dewey, one of the early 20th century's greatest philosophers, drawing on all of their work. Jacques Mezirow distilled this transformative learning theory, and I'll go to the next slide. And I've distilled it down into 5 principles, which will appear shortly. Hit the animation for me. Good. So very quickly at the top there, transformative learning is about helping students to engage with nature and engage with each other in relational learning. It's about social critique. It's about engaging students in learning to develop a critical voice about social issues. That's a kind of a finger-pointing thing. What's going wrong with the world around us and who's responsible? But it's also these 3 fingers pointing back this way, and that's where self-reflection is important. What are my values? What's my culpability in creating and reinforcing the problems? Do I take a plastic shopping bag and why? Do I drink water out of a plastic bottle and why? What do I do with it when I'm finished and why? So self-reflection is just so important. Then we have ethical envisioning, which brings in the shoulds. What should I do? How should I behave? How should we approach the problems of global climate change? So values, very important, social values. And finally, a commitment to putting things into action. So altogether, I call this developing a sense of moral agency. And I think that's so important if we're going to bring STEM into the 21st century to address the global crises, particularly sustainable development. That means that the arts can bring in all sorts of interesting expressions and modes of representation, and transformative learning theory gives us, as educators, the intellectual and scholarly power for curriculum development and for teaching and learning development. And that's really what's missing if you just look at the acronym STEM all by itself. It doesn't speak necessarily to how students learn and how teachers can collaborate to form multicultural, multidisciplinary curricula. Next slide. And just very briefly, this is a book that came out this year. It's a book that demonstrates how transformative learning theory has been very, very successful at the postgraduate level, engaging doctoral and master students of education, of STEM education, into a self-oriented inquiry into their own philosophies of teaching and learning. And a number of them are here. If the lights are on, I'll get them to stand up, and they will be presenting posters and oral presentations in the next couple of days. So the next slide. So the challenge is, how can we introduce transformative learning into STEM classrooms? So it's all very well to have all these lovely altruistic principles, but how can we do it? I think April has demonstrated some ways that that's possible, and I'll just focus on one particular way. Next slide. In the audience, we have Dr. Elizabeth Lily Taylor, who brought to Australia a very powerful approach called ethical dilemma story pedagogy. She brought it from her home country of Austria, and there's a book available down there for purchase. And what it's about is engaging kids in ethical dilemma thinking in STEM classrooms. So I'm not going to try and unpack this now, but there are a couple of people in the audience, doctoral students from Thailand and Indonesia, who will, 5 minutes left, thanks, who will be giving poster presentations, and I would encourage you, if you're interested in this, to go and have a talk to them about how they are bringing ethical dilemma teaching and learning into teacher education and into K-12 classrooms. So basically, very basically, it's about creating stories with children as the characters in those stories. And I was really pleased to see yesterday in the hackathon that a number of university students have developed projects for Ocean Park based around storytelling and role play. And I think we can take this into classrooms. In fact, we are doing that with this approach. So it's the focus, the topic, is both on disciplinary knowledge, whether it be chemistry education, biology education, or whatever. That disciplinary knowledge combined in various ways with values education through the story's characters. And children, therefore, in that scenario in the classroom, they engage in personal, individual, reflective thinking. They get into pairs and they share their ideas, and then they get into small groups and they try to reach some form of consensus about the best way forward to solve these social problems. We call this socially responsible science for the science educators, and there's a starting point. Science educators are taking it on in their own classrooms, and that's the seed. The next step is to collaborate with colleagues in the arts and so on. So this is not about displacing disciplinary knowledge and skills, it's about complementing and enriching the learning opportunities in those classrooms. Okay, next slide. We'll jump through that. That's Dr. Yuli Ramwati at University Negeri, Jakarta. She's bringing this into her M-Teach program. Next slide. This is a doctoral student of mine and Dr. Lily Taylor, who head of science, and he brought this approach into teaching genetics, where he introduced genetics into his Year 10 science classroom. And what he brought in was the ethics of genetically modified food. So the students got to learn not just about the objective scientific knowledge of genetics, but the social implications of genetically modifying the foods that we eat. And that website link will take you to the story that he used with his class. That was a doctoral study, and it revealed a lot about student engagement, willingness and unwillingness to move into this new learning space. Next slide, please. Okay, we have somebody in the audience up there, Piang Pratueng Sukmalanam from Konkan University in Thailand, a doctoral student, and this is very close to the topic that I'm talking on today. Her PhD research, investigating ethical dilemma teaching and learning in the science classroom, moving towards STEAM education. And the curriculum is science, chemistry and polymers. Now, as a doctoral student, she's doing the teaching herself in the laboratory school next to the university, and she's using a qualitative, largely a qualitative approach to reflect on the impact of her STEAM teaching on student learning. And she has a poster, and I suggest if you're interested, you go and have a chat to her about the progress that she's making. She wrote a really lovely dilemma story about the use of plastics in Thailand. Next slide, and we're getting toward the end here. So summing up, STEAM education with 2 T's in it, the second one being for transformative education, so we might just call it transformative STEAM education, provides educators with a philosophy of sustainability education for the 21st century. It urges teachers, it provides a justification, a curriculum justification for transdisciplinary, or if you like, multidisciplinary curriculum design, but not just focusing on content, focusing on these transdisciplinary capabilities like creative thinking, like ethical awareness, and like critical reflective thinking and so on, which are not discipline specific, but they're overarching capabilities for employment, which is very important. It's a number one imperative in most Western democracies. School must fuel the workforce, but equally importantly, citizenship. And that's a 1 minute, thanks. That's a really important overarching philosophy in Indonesia, that all disciplines must teach kids citizenship education. And that's why ethical dilemma pedagogy is finding traction in Indonesian university teacher education programs. And I think we'll have one final slide. Okay, this give us, so I'm drawing on my physics background here. This is quantum theory, the notion of quantum entanglement, and I'm using it as a backdrop to illustrate that around the world at the moment we have many, many acronyms, and they all have something to do with each other, but none of them is going to win the day alone. But I'm putting forward transformative STEAM education as the next best step forward in order to provide educators with the opportunity to enrich their teaching practices and students' learning experiences, and particularly to address these global crises and emergencies that we just cannot ignore. Okay, final slide. We'll skip the movie.
There's something I need to tell you.
We'll skip the movie.
This relationship isn't working.
She has a relationship breakdown with plastic, so it's a lovely thing to watch. It's very compelling, but we're sort of running out of time. The 3 R's, it used to be reading, writing and arithmetic, but now reduce your use of plastics, reuse them if you have to use them, and recycle by all means. It's the new 3 R's, so that's the take-home message. Okay, in Indonesia, terima kasih, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you very much for Professor Taylor's keynote seminar. I'm sure that all of us have learned so much with the keynote speakers today. Let's give a big clap for all of our keynote speakers again. Thank you very much.